When was the first hospital established in North America?
It was in 1503 when the Spanish built a hospital in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, then known as Hispaniola. It is no longer in existence, but ruins remain. On the North American mainland, the first hospital was opened in Quebec, Canada, in 1639. The first incorporated hospital in the United States was the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Chartered in 1751 with the support of statesman Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790.
What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. He directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports, and the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.
What was the chronology of events on September 11, 2001?
The sequence of events related to the terrorist attacks on September 11 were as follows. All times are Eastern Daylight Time 8:46 a.m. A passenger plane crashes into the North Tower of New York City's World Trade Center. At first it is assumed to be an accident. But within hours, it is learned that the plane was American Airlines Flight 11, and commandeered by hijackers shortly after takeoff from Boston headed to Los Angeles. It carried 81 passengers, including 5 hijackers, and 11 crew members. 9:03 a.m. A second passenger plane slams into the South Tower of the World Trade Center and explodes. United Airlines later announces that this was Flight 175, another Boston-Los Angeles plane. It carried 56 passengers, including 5 hijackers, and 9 crew members. Both towers of the World Trade Center are in flames. 9:21 a.m. Bridges and tunnels leading into New York City are closed. Within the hour, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, 1944, orders an evacuation of Manhattan south of Canal Street. 9:25 a.m. All flights in the United States are grounded. It is the first time in history that the Federal Airlines Administration, FAA, halts all flights. 9:30 a.m. President George W. Bush, 1946, scheduled to speak at a grade school in Sarasota, Florida, remarks that the nation has been the target of an apparent terrorist attack. 9:45 a.m. A third passenger plane crashes into the east wall of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The plane was American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 58 passengers, including 5 hijackers and 6 crew members. It originated at Washington, D.C.'s Dulles International Airport and was headed to Los Angeles. After being hijacked, the plane made a U-turn over the Ohio-Kentucky border to return to the Washington, D.C. area, where it hit its intended target. 9:45 a.m. The White House is evacuated. 10:05 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:10 a.m. A large section of the Pentagon collapses. 10:10 a.m., a fourth passenger plane crashes in a field in Somerset County, in southwestern Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. It was United Airlines Flight 93, originating in Newark, New Jersey, and bound for San Francisco. After being hijacked, the plane made a U-turn over Ohio and was headed for a target in Washington, D.C., later thought to be Camp David, the White House, or the U.S. Capitol building. After learning via cell phones of the other hijackings, a group of passengers stormed the cockpit in an effort to take the plane, which crashed in the countryside. The plane carried 37 passengers, including 4 hijackers, and a crew of 7. There were no survivors. 10:24 a.m. The FAA reports that it has diverted all incoming transatlantic flights to Canada. 10:28 a.m. The North Tower of the World Trade Center falls. The collapse of each tower blankets lower Manhattan in smoke and ash, turning the brilliantly sunny day to darkness. 10:45 a.m., all federal office buildings in the nation's capital are evacuated. 2 p.m. Senior FBI sources reveal to the media that they are working under the assumption that the 4 airplanes that crashed were part of a terrorist attack. The FBI later learns the identities of all 19 hijackers. There were 5 on board each plane. Except Flight 93, which had 4 p.m., media reports indicate that U.S. officials have credible evidence tying the morning's attacks to Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, 1957, 5:20 p.m. Building 7, a 47-story structure, of the World Trade Center complex collapses. Nearby buildings are in flames.
When was instant messaging introduced?
The ability to send instant text messages over computers was introduced to the public in 1996. Internet Service Provider America Online, AOL, launched instant messaging, or IM, as another way for its members to communicate with each other. By logging onto a home or work computer, or cell phone with internet capabilities. Users could view their buddy list and see which of their AOL contacts were online at the time. IM users could then send messages back and forth in real time, next door, or across thousands of miles. In 1997, AOL expanded the service to non-AOL users with a utility called AOL Instant Messaging, AIM, and in 1998 the company acquired another IM utility, ICQ. By 1999 MSN and Yahoo rolled out their instant messenger services, and others followed. The concept caught on, particularly with young users who embraced the concept of a private chat room. In 2004, a Pew Internet and American Life Project report estimated that 53 million Americans, or 4 out of 10 Internet users, were instant messaging. IM had become the primary form of communication for many, replacing telephone calls and emails. The mode of communication also brought about a new shorthand, or subculture language, with a heavy reliance on abbreviations and icons. The use of the technology continued to grow rapidly, expanding to practical business use. In 2004, analysts estimated that there were about 600 million registered IM users worldwide.
What is the Kyoto Protocol?
It is an environmental agreement signed by 141 nations that agree to work to slow global warming by limiting emissions, cutting them by 5.2% by 2012. Each nation has its own target to meet. The protocol was drawn up December 11, 1997, in the ancient capital of Kyoto, Japan, and went into effect on February 16, 2005. The United States is not among the signatories. American officials said the agreement is flawed because large developing countries including India and China were not immediately required to meet specific targets for reduction. Upon the protocol's enactment, Japan's Prime Minister called on non-signatory nations to rethink their participation. saying that there was a need for a common framework to stop global warming. Environmentalists echoed his call to action.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages. 500-1350.
Why was the battle at Gettysburg important?
The 1863 battle, fought when the two sides met accidentally in the southern Pennsylvania town, was a turning point in the Civil War. From July 1 to 3, General George Meade, 1815 to 1872, led his troops, about 90,000 strong, to defeat the advancing Confederate troops, numbering some 75,000, under General Robert E. Lee. 1807 to 1870, the Union win effectively stopped Lee's invasion of the North. The following November 19, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, made the historical address at Gettysburg, as he dedicated part of the battlefield as a national cemetery. Beginning with the now famous words 77 years ago our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The short speech, which Lincoln rewrote many times, closed by issuing a rallying cry for the nation as a whole, saying, "We here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that governments of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth."
Is there slavery today?
Yes, slavery continues into the 21st century. The United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, has stated, although slavery has been formally abolished from the world, the trade in human misery continues. Today it is called human trafficking. Estimating the size of the problem is difficult, but the UNFPA estimates that about 4 million people are trafficked across international borders each year. The group also reports that the problem is widespread, but the greatest volume of human trafficking exists in Asia, with Africa and Latin America following close behind. The Asia-Pacific region is seen as particularly vulnerable. According to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNESCAP, because of its huge population pyramid, growing urbanization, and extensive poverty, some human rights groups estimate that the number of slaves in the world today is as high as 27 million people. and experts say that it is a growing problem, fueled by globalization. Men, women, and children, especially in developing countries, are forced into labor in sweatshops and fields, and into prostitution in brothels. In desperately poor regions of the world, families sell their children into slave labor and forced prostitution. Other victims are lured in, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. From Himalayan villages to Eastern European cities, people, especially women and girls, are attracted by the prospect of a well-paid job as a domestic servant, waitress, or factory worker. Traffickers recruit victims through fake advertisements, mail-order bride catalogs, and casual acquaintances. But the victims end up in situations controlled by their traffickers, and they are exploited against their wills to earn illicit revenues. By the early 2000s, human rights groups and governments were organizing to combat the increase in human trafficking. Several agencies of the United Nations work to address the roots of the problem and to aid victims. Non-government agencies were playing a role as well. One such group is Shared Hope International. Founded in 1998 by U.S. Congresswoman Linda Smith, Washington, to rescue and restore women and children in crisis by providing comprehensive services to meet their needs. Italy's government was at the forefront of the anti-trafficking movement, offering residency permits to victims and funding local shelters through legislation passed in 1999. In 2000, the U.S. Congress passed the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, TVPA, declaring that sex trafficking is the modern-day slavery. Government figures estimated that each year 45,000 to 50,000 women and children were trafficked into the United States, where they were trapped in modern-day slavery-like situations such as forced prostitution. But the trafficking problem in the United States, and elsewhere, is not limited to importing women and children from other countries. According to a September 2001 Justice Department report, 400,000 children are lured or forced into prostitution each year in the United States. Many of the victims are from white, working and middle-class families, often runaways from troubled homes who end up on the streets. In September 2004, former Representative John R. Miller, Washington, was sworn into the newly created position of Ambassador at Large for the U.S. State Department's Anti-Trafficking Office. In a speech, Miller said, "Today, the slavery is not on plantations and in homes. It is in factories and armies as well, and especially in brothels. But the slave masters use the same tools today as earlier slave masters: kidnapping, fraud, threats, and beatings, all aimed at forcing women, children, and men into labor and sex exploitation." Experts agreed that ending human trafficking in the 21st century would require a coalition of government, special interest groups, human rights organizations, and other non-government organizations. Determining the scope of the problem and raising public awareness were important first steps.
Why did the United States get involved in World War I?
When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Americans opposed the involvement of U.S. troops, and President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, declared the country's neutrality. But as the fighting continued and the German tactics threatened civilian lives, Americans began siding with the Allies. After the sinking of the passenger liner SS Lusitania, Germany adopted restricted submarine warfare. But early in 1917 Germany again began attacking unarmed ships. This time American cargo boats, goading the United States into the war. Meantime, German U-boats were positioning to cut off shipping to and from Britain, in an effort to force the power to surrender. Tensions between the United States and Germany peaked when the British intercepted, decoded, and turned over to President Wilson a telegram Germany had sent to its ambassador in Mexico. The so-called Zimmermann Note, which originated in the office of German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann. 1864–1940, urged the German officials in Mexico to persuade the Mexican government into war with the United States in order to reconquer lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The message was published in the United States in early March. 1 month later, on April 6, 1917, the U.S. Congress declared war on Germany. After President Wilson had asserted that the world must be made safe for democracy.
Who was the first person to reach the North Pole?
There has been some dispute over this one. The credit usually goes to American explorer and former naval officer Robert E. Peary, 1856–1920, who, after several tries, reached the North Pole by dog sled on April 6, 1909, along with Matthew A. Henson and 3 Inuit companions. Unbeknownst to him, 5 days before this achievement, another American explorer, Dr. Frederick Cook, 1865–1940, claimed that he had reached the North Pole a year earlier. Peary and Cook knew each other. Cook had been the surgeon on the Peary Arctic expedition of 1891 to 1892, which reached Greenland. And for his part, Cook's claim was investigated by scientists. But the evidence he supplied did not substantiate the claim. Thus, Peary was recognized as the first to reach the northern extremity of Earth's axis.
What was the Bolshevik Revolution?
It was the November 1917 revolution in which the Bolsheviks an extremist faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, later renamed the Russian Communist Party. Seized control of the government, ushering in the Soviet age. The event is also known as the October Revolution since by the old Russian calendar, in use until 1918. The government takeover happened on October 25. The Bolshevik Revolution was the culmination of a series of events in 1917. In March, with Russia still in the midst of World War I, 1914-18, the country faced hardship. Shortages of food and fuel made conditions miserable. The people had lost faith in the war effort and were loath to support it by sending any more young men into battle. In the Russian capital of Petrograd, which had been known as St. Petersburg until 1914, workers went on strike and rioting broke out. In the chaos, called the March Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II, 1868-1918, ordered the legislative body, the Duma, to disband. Instead, the representatives set up a provisional government. Having lost all political influence, Nicholas abdicated the throne on March 15. He and his family were imprisoned and are believed to have been killed in July of the following year. Hearing of Nicholas's abdication, longtime political exile Vladimir Lenin, 1870-1924, returned from Europe to Petrograd, where he led the Bolsheviks in rallying the Russian people with calls for peace, land reform, and worker empowerment. Their slogan was land, peace, and bread. The Bolsheviks grew in numbers and became increasingly radical, in spite of efforts by the provisional government headed by revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, 1881-1970, to curb the Bolsheviks' influence. The only socialist member of the first provisional government, Kerensky's government proved ineffective and failed to meet the demands of the people. He also failed to end the country's involvement in World War I, which the Bolsheviks viewed as an imperialistic war. On November 7 the Bolsheviks led workers and disgruntled soldiers and sailors in a takeover of Petrograd's Winter Palace, the scene of Bloody Sunday in 1905, and which had become the headquarters of Kerensky's provisional government. By November 8 the provisional government had fallen.
When was leprosy first diagnosed?
Leprosy is an ages-old disease, described in many historical texts. Mentioned in the Bible, leprosy was introduced in Europe in the 400s BC. Probably by the troops of the Persian ruler Xerxes, c. 519-465 BC, as they moved westward. By the 12th century leprosy had reached epidemic proportions in Western Europe, even claiming the lives of rulers. Portugal's Alfonso II died from it in 1223, and Robert I, King of Scots, in 1329. Explorers and settlers from the European continent later carried the infectious chronic skin disease to the New World, where it was previously unknown. The cause of leprosy was unknown. While some theorized it was contagious, others asserted that it was hereditary or was caused by eating certain foods. Even potatoes were at one time blamed for originating the affliction. The disease gradually disappeared from Europe, attributable to improved living conditions, better nutrition, and, later, the advent of drugs that are effective in treatment. The first clinical description was not made until 1874 when Norwegian physician Gerhard Henrik Hansen, 1841 to 1912, discovered the leprosy bacterium. Since then the disease has also been called Hansen's disease. Today, leprosy afflicts about 5 million people worldwide. It is endemic, native, to tropical or subtropical regions, including Africa, Central and South America, India, and Southeast Asia. Most cases of leprosy that occur in the United States are among immigrants from areas where the disease is endemic. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the Roman Catholic nun Mother Teresa, 1910 to 1997, of Calcutta ministered to those afflicted with leprosy, setting up colonies for their care.
What caused the Vietnam War?
In the simplest terms, the long conflict in Southeast Asia was fought over the unification of Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam. The two countries had been set up in 1954. Prior to that, all of Vietnam was part of the French colony of Indochina. But in 1946, the Vietnamese fought the French for control of their own country. The United States provided financial support to France. But the French were ultimately defeated in 1954. Once France had withdrawn its troops, an international conference was convened in Geneva to decide what should be done with Vietnam. The country was divided into two partitions, along the 17th parallel. This division of land was not intended to be permanent. But the elections that were supposed to reunite the partitions were never held. Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh, 1892 to 1969, took power in the north while Emperor Bao Dai, 1913 to 1997, for a while, ruled the south. But the communist government in the north opposed the non-communist government of South Vietnam and believed the country should still be united. The North Vietnamese supported anti-government groups in the south and over time stepped up aid to those groups. These communist-trained South Vietnamese were known as the Viet Cong. Between 1957 and 1965, the Viet Cong struggled against the South Vietnamese government. But in the mid-1960s, North Vietnam initiated a large-scale troop infiltration into South Vietnam, and the fighting became a full-fledged war. China and the Soviet Union provided the North Vietnamese with military equipment, but not manpower. The United States provided both equipment and troops to non-communist South Vietnam in its struggle against the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. By 1969 there were more than 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. This policy was controversial back in America, where protests to involvement in the Vietnam War continued until the last U.S. troops were brought home in 1973. In January of that year, the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire, but the fighting broke out again after the American ground troops left. On April 30, 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam and the war, which had lasted nearly 2 decades, ended. North Vietnam unified the countries as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For its part, the North Vietnamese called the conflict a war of national liberation. They viewed the long struggle as an extension of the earlier struggle with France. They also perceived the war to be another attempt by a foreign power, this time the United States, to rule Vietnam.
What was the Sino-Japanese War?
This dispute between China and Japan, who had not that long ago clashed in the Chinese-Japanese War of 1894–95, began in 1937 and was absorbed by World War II, 1939–45. The trouble between the Asian powers began when Japan, having already taken Manchuria and the Jahal province from China, attacked China again. Though China was in the midst of internal conflict with the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. 1887–1975, fighting the Communists under Mao Zedong. 1893–1976, China turned its attention to fighting the foreign aggressor. The fighting between the two countries continued into 1941 before war was officially declared by China. In so doing, China was at war not only with the Japanese, but with Japan's Axis allies Germany and Italy as well. The conflict then became part of World War II, which ended with the surrender of Japan to the Allies in September 1945.
What caused the East-West Schism in the Catholic Church?
During the Middle Ages, 500–1350, cultural, geographical, and even political differences caused an increasingly wide divide between the Catholic churches in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, as well as in parts of Western Asia, and West, the Catholic churches of Western Europe. In the 800s a series of theological disputes began between the highest authority of the Eastern, Byzantine churches, called the Patriarch of Constantinople, also called the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Pope, particularly about the Pope's authority over Christians in the East. Finally, in 1054, Pope Leo IX 1002–1054, issued an anathema, a formal curse, against the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, c. 1000–1059, excommunicating him and his followers from the Roman Catholic Church. The Church had officially split. Thereafter the Eastern Orthodox churches would accept the Patriarch of Constantinople as the highest church authority. In other words, they did not acknowledge the primacy of the Pope, and they would follow the Byzantine rite, ceremonies, in the West. Roman Catholics followed the Latin rite and continued to regard the Pope as the Holy Father. When the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 1453, Orthodox Christians in the East came under Muslim rule. This lasted into the 1800s. Though there are still differences between the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, etc., and the Roman Catholic Church today, the rift between them was healed in 1964 when Pope Paul VI, 1897 to 1978, met with Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I, 1886 to 1972, in Jerusalem. The following year, the two religious leaders lifted the mutual anathemas between their churches.
How were Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt related?
The two men, among America's most well-known presidents, were distant cousins. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, was born in New York City, and after a career in public service that included organizing the first volunteer cavalry regiment that was known as the Rough Riders. The ardent outdoors enthusiast became vice president in 1901. When President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, died in office later that year, on September 14, Teddy Roosevelt succeeded him as president. He was elected in his own right in 1904 and went on to serve until 1909. Spending nearly 2 full terms in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was President of the United States when he walked his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, down the aisle on March 17, 1905. The young woman was marrying her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, who had been courting her since he entered college at Harvard in 1900. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York. Like his fifth cousin Theodore, Franklin went on to a life of public service, which bore some remarkable similarities to that of his cousin. Both Theodore and Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, 1897 to 98 and 1913 to 20, respectively. And both were governors of New York, 1899 to 1900 and 1929 to 1933, respectively. As presidents, both served the nation for more than one term, but Franklin Roosevelt made history for being the only president to be elected for third and fourth terms. In 1951, the U.S. Congress voted in favor of the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidential tenure to just 2 terms. Both served the country in times of conflict. For Theodore it was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, which he was instrumental in ending with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on September 5, 1905, and for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the so-called Big Three leaders, along with Britain's Sir Winston Churchill. 1874 to 1965, and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953. He coordinated the Allied nations' effort against Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II, 1939 to 45. He, too, was a champion of peace, having been central in laying plans for the United Nations. It's an interesting note, however, that when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president in 1912, he was opposed by his young Democratic cousin Franklin, then a state senator in New York, who supported Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, in the presidential race. After Wilson was elected, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post that delighted him for combining his vocation, politics, with his avocation, ships, and one that certainly furthered his political career. By the end of World War I, 1914 to 18, Franklin Roosevelt was a well-known national figure. Theodore and Franklin also shared an interest in outdoor activities. But Franklin's participation in sports was curtailed when he was stricken with polio in August 1921. The 39-year-old Roosevelt was paralyzed for a time. And though he later regained movement and was able to walk with braces, he never fully recovered. Through fierce determination he continued his life of public service, becoming president in 1933. He saw the country through two of its most trying periods, the Great Depression, 1929 to 39, and World War II, 1939 to 45. He died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage in April 1945.
What was the Enola Gay?
It was the American B-29 bomber that dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, Japan, to drop a bomb over the city. The explosion killed an estimated 80,000 people and leveled an area of about 5 square miles in Hiroshima, an important manufacturing and military center. Thousands more died later from radiation exposure.
What happened to Slobodan Milosevic?
Like other Serb leaders involved in the recent Baltic Wars, former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, faced charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity at the International Court Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague. He was arrested in Belgrade on April 1, 2001, and transferred to The Hague in June. There he faced 66 counts of war crimes from the Balkan conflicts. Before the ICTY, he pled innocent of 3 indictments against him, one for each major war crime scene: Kosovo, Croatia, and Bosnia. His trial began on February 12, 2002, and was marked by numerous idiosyncrasies, including Milosevic's attempts to represent himself, without the benefit of counsel. His frequent refusals to cooperate with the court, and numerous days lost to his various illnesses. The prosecution wrapped up its case against him on February 25, 2004. After hearing testimony from almost 300 witnesses. The defense portion of the trial began on August 31, 2004, and was slated to last 150 court days. Not the same as calendar days. As of June 2005, the trial was still underway in The Hague.
When was public broadcasting started?
In the United States it was started in 1967, when the Public Broadcasting Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. 1908 to 1973, on November 7. Creating a corporation for public broadcasting to broaden the scope of non-commercial radio and TV beyond its educational role. Within 3 years, and as a result of federal grants, plus funds from foundations, business, and private contributions, Public Broadcasting Service (PBS) rivaled the big three networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, for viewers. In England, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, took control of the development of television in 1932, launching BBC TV. The BBC had been founded as a radio broadcaster in 1922 under the leadership of English engineer John Charles Reith, 1889 to 1971. Reith remained at the helm of the BBC for 16 years after its founding, and under his guidance, it became one of Britain's most revered institutions, supported by the public with license fees.
Was Shakespeare famous in his own time?
Yes, by 1592 he was well known as a dramatist. William Shakespeare, 1564–1616, was the son of John Shakespeare, who belonged to the merchant class, and Mary Arden, who came from a family of slightly higher social standing. His first plays, the 3 parts of the Henry VI history cycle, were presented in London in 1590 to 1592. The first reference to Shakespeare in the London literary world dates from 1592, when dramatist Robert Greene, c. 1558–92, referred to him as an upstart crow. The critical remark notwithstanding, Shakespeare's literary reputation and his acclaim grew over the next few years. He experimented with classical dramatic forms in the early tragedy Titus Andronicus, 1593–1594, and issued a pair of narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, 1593, and The Rape of Lucerus, 1594. These works, which played to the fashion for poems on mythological themes, were immensely successful, establishing honey-tongued Shakespeare as his contemporary Francis Mears. 1565 to 1647, called him as a prominent writer. Shakespeare further established himself as a professional actor and playwright when he joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company formed in 1594 when they began performing at theatres in London. In 1603 the group was renamed the King's Men. They became the foremost London company, largely attributable to the fact that after joining the group in 1594, Shakespeare wrote for no other company.
When was Amelia Earhart last heard from?
American aviator Amelia Earhart, 1897 to 1937, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, was last seen on July 1, 1937, and was last heard from on July 2, as she and navigator Fred Noonan. 1893 to 1937, attempted to make an around-the-world flight along the equator. The Kansas-born Earhart first became interested in aviation, which was very new at the time, during the early 1920s, and began taking flying lessons. In 1928 she was invited to be the only woman on board a transatlantic flight, which departed from Newfoundland and landed in Wales. The trip made her famous as the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. She followed that accomplishment in 1932 with a solo transatlantic flight. Earhart took off from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Canada, on the evening of May 20, 1932. Her destination was Paris. Within hours problems began for the aviator. She encountered a violent electrical storm. The altimeter failed, the wings iced up, and finally, the exhaust manifold caught on fire. Earhart decided to land in Ireland rather than attempting Paris. After a 15-hour flight, she touched down in a pasture outside of Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Again, fame and acclaim were hers, as the first woman to cross the Atlantic in a solo flight. She went on to set speed and distance records for aviation and soon conceived of the idea of flying around the world along the equator. On May 20, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Oakland, California. Reaching Miami, Florida, they stopped for repairs. On June 1, 1937, they departed Miami and headed for Brazil. From there, they flew across the Atlantic to Africa and then across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. Then it was on to Karachi, Pakistan, Calcutta, India, and Burma, present-day Myanmar. Earhart reached New Guinea on June 30, and she and Noonan prepared for the most difficult leg of the journey, to Howland Island. A tiny speck of land only 2.5 miles long in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. The next day, July 1, they left New Guinea and began the 2,600-mile flight to Howland Island. On July 2. A U.S. Navy vessel picked up radio messages from Earhart that indicated reports of empty fuel tanks. Efforts to make radio contact with her failed, though an extensive search effort ensued. No trace of the plane or two-person crew was found, and no one knows for certain what happened. Speculation surrounds the disappearance. One theory was that Earhart's true mission in making the around the world flight was to spy on the Japanese-occupied Pacific Islands. However, this has never been substantiated, and, given the circumstances under which they were flying, the likelihood is that the plane crashed into the ocean, claiming Earhart's and Noonan's lives.
Who were the code talkers?
Code talkers were Navajo Indians who provided secure communications for the U.S. military's Pacific operations during World War II, 1939–45. Serving in the Marines, the Navajo servicemen were recruited because of their language, which is unwritten and extremely complex. Military officials believed the Japanese would not be able to decipher intercepted communiques that were transmitted in the Navajo language. The first Navajo recruits attended boot camp in May 1942 and developed and memorized a dictionary of military terms to use in encrypting messages. The trained code talkers were deployed with Marine units throughout the Pacific theater. They worked around the clock, with tremendous speed and accuracy, to transmit vital information about military tactics, battle orders, and troop movements. Their messages were sent over telephone and radio, because of the complexity of the language. The Japanese military was never able to break the code. About 400 Navajos served as code talkers during the war, contributing mightily to the success of U.S. military assaults at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other Pacific venues.
What were the highlights of the Ming Dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming Dynasty. 1368–1644, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself, meaning bright or brilliant. Architects working during this period produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. Ming porcelain, bronze, and lacquerware are coveted collector's items today. Additionally, the novel and drama flourished. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people on the horizon. In 1644 the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912. Nevertheless, it was the Ming, and not the Manchu, who formed the last great and truly Chinese dynasty.
What happened at Normandy?
Normandy, a region in northwestern France that lies along the English Channel, is known for the June 6, 1944, arrival of Allied troops, which proved to be a turning point in World War II, 1939–45. Officially called Operation Overlord, but known historically as D-Day, and headed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1890–1969, of the United States. The initiative had been in the planning since 1943 and it constituted the largest seaborne invasion in history. After several delays due to poor weather, the Allied troops crossed the English Channel and arrived on the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6. Brutal fighting ensued that day, with heavy losses on both sides. At the end of the day, the Allied troops had taken hold of the beaches, a firm foothold that would allow them to march inland against the Nazis, eventually pushing them back to Germany. While it was a critical Allied victory, which history has treated as the beginning of the end for German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, the invasion at Normandy was still to be followed by 11 more months of bloody conflict. Germany would not surrender until May 7 of the following year.
Why is Descartes considered the father of modern philosophy?
French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, 1596–1650, was living in Holland in 1637 when he published his first major work, Discourse on Method. In this treatise, he extends mathematical methods to science and philosophy, asserting that all knowledge is the product of clear reasoning based on self-evident premises. This idea, that there are certitudes, provided the foundation for modern philosophy, which dates from the 1600s to the present. Descartes may be best known for the familiar phrase "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum," in Latin. This assertion is based on his theory that only one thing cannot be doubted, and that is doubt itself. The next logical conclusion is that the doubter, thinker, must, therefore, exist. The correlation to the dictum "I think, therefore I am," is dualism, the doctrine that reality consists of mind and matter. Since the thinker thinks and is, he or she is both mind, idealism, and body, matter, or material. Descartes concluded that mind and body are independent of each other, and he formulated theories about how they work together. Modern philosophers have often concerned themselves with the question of dualism. Descartes' other major works include Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, which is his most famous, and Principles of Philosophy, 1644. His philosophy became known as Cartesianism, from Cartesius, the Latin form of his name.
Was Monet the father of French Impressionism?
Though the movement was named for one of Claude Monet's, 1840–1926, paintings and his water lilies. 1905, are arguably the most well-known and highly acclaimed Impressionist works. Impressionism is actually rooted in the works of the group's spiritual leader, Edouard Manet, 1832–1883. Who first began experimenting with color and light to bring a more naturalistic quality to painting. In 1863 Manet exhibited two highly controversial and groundbreaking works. Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia. Both paintings were based on classic subjects. But Manet rendered these pastoral scenes according to his own experience, giving them a decidedly more earthy and blatantly erotic quality than the Parisian critics and academicians of the day could accept. He was roundly criticized for his scandalous exhibition. Nevertheless, Manet persevered, and in 1868, with his portrait of the French writer Émile Zola, he again challenged the art world and its values. A critic for Le National denounced the portrait and cited among his complaints that Zola's trousers were not made of cloth. This, the artists observed, was both truth and revelation. The pants were made of paint. A few years later, in 1870, Manet began experimenting with painting outside, in the brilliance of natural sunlight. Manet pioneered many of the ideas and techniques taken up by the Impressionists.
When did the U.S. labor movement begin?
It began in the early 1800s, when skilled workers, such as carpenters and blacksmiths, banded together in local organizations with the goal of securing better wages. By the time fighting broke out in the Civil War, 1861–65, the first national unions had been founded again, by skilled workers. However, many of these early labor organizations struggled to gain widespread support and soon fell apart. But by the end of the century, several national unions, including the United Mine Workers, 1890, and the American Railway Union, 1893, emerged. In the last 2 decades of the 1800s, violence accompanied labor protests and strikes while opposition to the unions mounted. Companies shared blacklists of the names of workers suspected of union activities, hired armed guards to forcibly break strikes, and retained lawyers to successfully invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, to crush strikes. Lawyers argued that strikes interfered with interstate commerce, which was declared illegal by the Sherman legislation, which had not been the intent of the lawmakers. In the early decades of the 1900s, unions made advances. But many Americans continued to view organizers and members as radicals. The climate changed for the unions during the Great Depression, 1929–39. With so many Americans out of work, many blamed business leaders for the economy's failure and began to view the unions in a new light as organizations to protect the interests of workers. In 1935, the federal government strengthened the union's cause in passing the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, protecting the rights to organize and to bargain collectively. When worker representatives, usually labor union representatives, negotiate with employers. The legislation also set up the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, which still works today to penalize companies that engage in unfair labor practices. The constitutionality of the act was challenged in court in 1937. But the Supreme Court upheld the legislation. The unions grew increasingly powerful over the next decade. By 1945, more than one-third of all non-agricultural workers belonged to a union. Having made important gains during World War II, 1939–45, including hospital insurance coverage, paid vacations and holidays, and pensions, union leaders continued to urge workers to strike to gain more ground. Something leaders felt was the workers' right amidst the unprecedented prosperity of the post-war era. But strikes soon impacted the life of the average American. Consumers faulted the unions for shortages of consumer goods, suspension of services, and inflated prices. Congress responded by passing the Labor Management Relations Act, or the Taft-Hartley Act, in 1947, which limits the impact of unions by prohibiting certain kinds of strikes, setting rules for how unions could organize workers, and establishing guidelines for how strikes that may impact the nation's health or safety are to be handled.
Who was more important to rock and roll, Elvis Presley or the Beatles?
While music historians and fans of either or both may be willing to offer an opinion, the question cannot be definitively answered. The fact is that popular music today would not be what it is had it not been for both Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And the influences of both are still felt. Elvis Presley, 1935–1977, brought to music an exciting and fresh combination of country, gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues music, and topped it all off with a style and sense of showmanship that dazzled young audiences. His first commercial recording was That's All Right, Mama in 1954, which was followed in 1956 by the success of Heartbreak Hotel. Between 1956 and 1969 he had 17 #1 records. Presley defined a new musical style and an era. Among those the American Presley had influenced were four English musicians who called themselves the Beatles. Originally founded as the Quarrymen by John Lennon, 1940–1980, in 1956. The group became the most popular rock and roll band of the 1960s. Their first single was Love Me Do, released on October 5, 1962, and producer George Martin was encouraged that the Beatles could produce a #1 record. In 1963 they did. Please Please Me was released in Britain on January 12 and was an immediate hit. Other hits off their first album included She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. The follow-up album, With the Beatles, was released in 1964 and established them as Britain's favorite group. Already popular in their homeland, Beatlemania began in the United States on February 7, 1964, when the mop-topped Fab Four, Lennon along with Paul McCartney, b. 1942, George Harrison, 1943 to 2001, and Ringo Starr, b. 1940, arrived at New York's Kennedy International Airport and were met by a mob of more than 10,000 screaming fans and 110 police officers. 2 days later, on February 9, the Beatles made their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. By April the group held onto the top 5 positions on the US singles charts. The British invasion had begun. In their early years, the Beatles brought a new energy to rock and roll and picked up where Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard had left off. The instrumentation and orchestration of Beatles songs, for which their producer George Martin deserves at least some of the credit, were innovative at the time, and are common for rock music today. Their rock movies, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, and Help, 1965, were a precursor to the music videos of today. When the band decided to break up, the April 10, 1970, announcement proved to be the end of an era.